Enzo destroys the bakery's morning work. Enzo Caruso, a ruthless mafia boss, is determined to demolish a historic district to build his new headquarters. Maya Santoro, a resilient baker, refuses to sell the shop that represents her family's survival. After Enzo personally vandalizes her shop to intimidate her, he undergoes a routine medical checkup for a lingering war injury. There, he discovers that Maya was the anonymous angel who saved his life in a literal trench. 10. Before we continue, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more powerful and inspiring stories. The view from the 42nd floor of the Caruso Holdings building was designed to make a man feel like a god, or at the very least, a king. From behind his floor-to-ceiling glass walls, Chateau Enzo Caruso watched the city pulse like a map of veins he intended to bleed. The evening sun caught the silver head of his cane as he leaned against the cold pane, his reflection staring back at him, stern, sharp, and entirely devoid of the dust and grime of the streets below. To the world, Enzo was the architect of the new skyline. To the underworld, he was the Iron Dawn. He lived in a fortress of glass and polished marble, a place where the air was filtered and the silence was absolute. Here, there was no smell of yeast, no sound of laughter, and certainly no room for sentiment. On his mahogany desk lay the blueprints for the Caruso Heights project. It was a sprawling complex of steel and obsidian that would rise from the rubble of the old district, a testament to his power. The permits for the North Block are finalized, his advisor, Marco, said quietly from the doorway. Marco remained in the shadows, knowing better than to disturb the dawn when he was staring at his kingdom. The demolition crews are on standby for next month. Every lease has been terminated. Every tenant has been moved. Enzo didn't turn around. He traced a line on the glass, pointing toward a small, dark blemish in the center of his planned paradise. Except for the bakery. The girl is stubborn, Enzo, Marco replied, a hint of frustration in his voice. She refuses to even look at the settlement papers. We've tripled the offer. She won't budge. Enzo gripped the handle of his cane until his knuckles turned as white as the flour he had crushed earlier that morning. The memory of the girl, Maya, kneeling in the wreckage of her life, flashed briefly behind his eyes. He remembered the way she hadn't looked at him with fear, but with a strange, haunting pity. It was a look that had stayed with him all day, an itch he couldn't scratch. Stubbornness is a luxury the weak cannot afford, Enzo said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He turned away from the window, the expensive fabric of his dark three-piece suit whispering against the stillness of the room. The golden grain sits on the exact spot where the main pylon must go. If she won't move for gold, she will move for fear. I want the pressure increased. Cut the power lines. Block the delivery routes. Make it so that not even a mouse can get a crust of bread out of that shop without my permission. He sat in his leather chair, the weight of his 40 years pressing into his spine. As he moved, a sharp, too familiar spike of pain radiated from the small of his back, a jagged reminder of the shrapnel he carried near his vertebrae. He closed his eyes for a second, the phantom cold of a rain-soaked alleyway from 10 years ago threatening to seep into his climate-controlled office. He pushed the sensation down. He had built this fortress of glass specifically to keep the cold out. He had traded his blood and his soul to never be the boy in the dirt again. She thinks she is protecting a legacy, Enzo muttered, more to himself than to Marco. He looked down at the blueprints, where the bakery was marked with a red X. But in this city, legacies are written in concrete and steel, not bread and kindness. Break her, Marco. I want that lot cleared by the 1st of the month." As Marco withdrew, Enzo picked up his hat, still the silence of the high-rise closing in around him once more. He was the king of the skyline, but as the moon rose over the city, the old wound in his back throbbed with a rhythmic, punishing heat, a debt he had forgotten, calling out from the very neighborhood he was preparing to destroy. The smell of scorched sugar and damp plaster hung heavy in the air, a bitter replacement for the usual perfume of yeast and orange zest. Maya Santoro knelt on the cold tiles of the golden grain, her fingers grazing the jagged edge of a broken ceramic jar. She didn't move to wipe the tear that finally escaped. She simply watched it fall into the white dust of the flour that coated the floor like a shroud. The bakery was more than a business. It was a living, breathing diary of 3 generations of Santoro women. The oven in the back, a monstrous cast-iron beast that took 4 hours to heat, had been seasoned by her grandmother's calloused hands. The recipe for the rosemary sourdough was a secret passed down during the lean years of the war, a bread that had fed the neighborhood when the markets were empty and the streets were filled with the sound of gunfire. "They're coming back, Maya," a voice whispered from the doorway. It was Mrs. Gable from the apartment upstairs, her face pale behind the glass of the front door. "I saw the black cars. They're cutting the street lamps. They want us to live in the dark until we leave." Maya stood up slowly, brushing the flour from her green dress. Her knees ached, but her spine felt like a rod of tempered steel. "Let them cut the lights," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "The oven runs on gas and fire. We don't need their electricity to bake." She looked at the counter where Enzo Caruso's cane had struck. The wood was scarred, a deep gouge in the mahogany that her father had polished every Sunday for 20 years. Enzo was a man of cold lines and expensive suits, a man who thought the world could be bought if the price was high enough, or broken if it wasn't. He had looked at her as if she were a smudge on a blueprint, something to be erased so his towers could reach the clouds. But Maya remembered a different kind of man. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting second, the pristine bakery vanished. She was 19 again, crouched in a freezing alleyway behind this very shop. The air had smelled of copper and rain. She remembered the weight of a dying boy in her arms, his blood soaking through her thin coat as she used her sewing kit and high-proof grappa to bind a wound that should have been fatal. He had been terrified then, his eyes wide and pleading, reaching for her hand as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. She hadn't asked for his name. She hadn't asked which side of the territory war he fought for. She had simply stayed with him until the sun rose, whispering that the dawn always comes if you hold on long enough. Looking at the ruin of her shop now, she wondered if that boy had survived only to become the monster standing over her with a silver-topped cane. The power flickered once, then died, plunging the shop into a thick, suffocating velvet. Outside, the rhythmic hum of the city felt distant, replaced by the idling engines of the black sedans parked at the curb like vultures. Maya didn't reach for a candle. She walked through the dark, guided by the memory of every inch of the room, and placed her hand on the side of the great iron oven. It was still warm. "He thinks he can starve us out," Maya whispered into the shadows, her jaw tightening. "He thinks his steel is stronger than our history." She reached for a fresh bag of flour, the heavy burlap scratching against her palms. With a deliberate, defiant motion, she sliced it open. Tonight, she would bake. She would bake until the scent of rosemary and warm crust drifted out into the rain, through the cracked windows, and straight into the lungs of the men waiting in the dark. Enzo Caruso wanted her territory, but he didn't understand that the land didn't belong to him. It belonged to the people who bled for it, and Maya Santoro wasn't finished bleeding yet. The silence of the penthouse was usually a sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a tomb. Enzo sat on the edge of his bed, his silk shirt discarded, as a jagged heat radiated from the base of his spine. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a rhythmic, pulsing reminder of a night he had spent 10 years trying to outrun. The shrapnel, a twisted piece of lead from a rival's grenade, sat nestled against his vertebrae like a parasite. He reached back, his fingers tracing the puckered, silver scar tissue that marred the skin of his lower back. Usually, the pain was manageable, a price he paid for his crown. But since he had stepped into that bakery, since he had looked into Maya Santoro's eyes, the wound had begun to throb with a renewed, vengeful life. It felt as if the metal was trying to wake up. By dawn, the pain had stolen his ability to walk without the heavy support of his cane. He didn't call his usual associates. He called a private clinic on the outskirts of the city, a place where discretion was bought with the same currency as medicine. Dr. Varga, a man whose hair had turned white in the service of the city's most dangerous men, looked at the fresh X-rays with a frown that deepened the lines on his forehead. "It's shifting, Enzo. The fragment is migrating toward the nerve. If we don't operate within the week, you won't just be walking with a cane. You'll be watching your empire from a wheelchair." Enzo gripped the edge of the examination table, his jaw tight. "Then fix it. I have a plaza to build." "I can perform the surgery," Varga said, turning toward an old, dusty filing cabinet in the corner of the office. "But I've been looking through the intake records from the night you were brought in. It's a miracle you're even standing today. The initial field dressing, it shouldn't have worked. Someone stitched a ruptured artery in a dark alley with the precision of a vascular surgeon. Without that, you would have bled out in 20 minutes. Enzo looked away, his mind drifting back to the trenches of the old district. He remembered the smell of rain-soaked trash and the iron tang of his own blood. He remembered a pair of hands, small, steady, and smelling faintly of something sweet, pressing against his side. He had been a soldier then, a nobody fighting for a scrap of territory, and an angel had appeared out of the shadows to sew him back together. "I never knew who it was," Enzo muttered. "My men found me at dawn. They said the girl vanished when they arrived." Varga pulled a yellowed, handwritten folder from the back of the drawer. "The paramedics who finally took you to the hospital kept a record of the witness who called it in. They insisted on noting her name for the police report, though it was buried in the archives when your lawyers cleaned your history." Varga slid the file across the table. Enzo opened it with a hand that, for the first time in a decade, trembled. Attached to the back of the report was a grainy black-and-white photocopy of a local ID card, a requirement for the Good Samaritan law at the time. The face was younger, the hair shorter, but the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same calm, defiant eyes that had stared him down yesterday amidst the ruins of a flower-strewn bakery floor. Maya Santoro. The air in the sterile room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The angel who had knelt in the dirt to save a dying boy was the same woman he had just ordered his men to break. The bread he had crushed under his boot was made by the hands that had once held his heart inside his chest. Enzo stood up, the pain in his spine screaming, but he ignored it. He stared at the name on the file until the ink seemed to burn into his retinas. He had spent years building a fortress of glass to protect himself from the world. But the foundation was built on a debt he had never repaid. and he had just spent the last 48 hours trying to destroy the only person he truly owed. "Enzo?" Varga asked, noticing the Don's sudden pallor. "Are you all right?" Enzo didn't answer. He grabbed his hat and his cane, the silver head of the wolf biting into his palm. He walked out of the clinic, the rhythmic thud click of his stride echoing like a heartbeat. He didn't need a surgeon to tell him what was wrong. The shrapnel wasn't the problem. It was the realization that the king was a traitor to his own life. The rain that night hadn't been a drizzle. It was a deluge that turned the industrial district into a labyrinth of slick oil and red blood. Enzo, barely 24 and far from a king, dragged his body through a narrow alleyway behind the docks. Every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. A rival gang's grenade had caught him mid-retreat, and the heat in his lower back told him he was leaking life faster than he could crawl. He collapsed against a stack of wooden crates, his vision tunneling into a pinprick of gray. The trenches, the nickname for the sunken, forgotten corridors of the old district, were a graveyard for boys like him. He waited for the cold to take him, his hand clutching a rusted pipe as if he could fight death itself. Then, the heavy steel door of a nearby service entrance groaned open. A sliver of warm, amber light spilled into the wet dark. A girl stepped out, no older than 19, silhouetted against a backdrop of hanging copper pots and bags of flour. She wasn't supposed to be there. This was a war zone, not a kitchen. "Help!" Enzo wheezed, the word barely a rattle. She didn't run. She didn't scream for the police. She dropped to her knees in the filth, her simple dress soaking up the black rainwater instantly. Her face was pale, framed by damp curls, but her eyes were steady, frighteningly so. "Don't move," she whispered. Her voice was the only soft thing in a world made of concrete. She vanished for a second and returned with a sewing kit, a bottle of high-proof grappa, and a clean white apron. She didn't flinch at the sight of the jagged hole in his back. Instead, she bit her lip, poured the liquor over the wound, causing Enzo to howl into his own shoulder, and began to work. He remembered the sensation of the needle. In, out, pull, tight. He remembered the smell of her, not of blood or rain, but of sweet yeast and rosemary. It was the smell of a life he had never known, a life that didn't involve shadows and steel. "Why?" he managed to gasp, his forehead pressed against the wet brick. "I'm nobody. A soldier. My grandmother says that even a weed is a flower if you give it a chance to grow," she murmured, her fingers never shaking as she knotted the thread. She pressed a clean cloth against his spine, her weight leaning into him to stem the flow. "I won't let you die in the dirt, soldier. Not tonight." She stayed with him for hours. She shared the warmth of her own body, huddled against him in the shadows of the crates, while the sirens of the rival gangs wailed in the distance. She told him stories of the bakery, of the golden grain, of how bread was the only thing that could truly heal a neighborhood. She treated him as if he were precious, as if his life had a value beyond the territory he fought for. When the first gray light of dawn broke over the skyline, Enzo's strength returned enough for him to sit up. He heard the distant rumble of his own crew's black sedans searching for him. "Go," he whispered to her. "They can't see you here. It's dangerous." She looked at him one last time, her apron now ruined with his blood, a dark stain that would never come out. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for a favor. She simply touched his cheek with a flour-dusted hand. "Live," she said. "Make it worth the thread." Then she vanished back behind the steel door, leaving only the scent of rosemary in the damp air. 10 years later, sitting in his silent penthouse, Enzo felt the ghost of those fingers on his skin. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who had made it worth nothing. He hadn't become the flower she hoped for. He had become the boot that crushed the weeds. He had taken the life she gave him and used it to build a monument to his own greed. And now, he was using that same life to kill the very hands that had sewn him together. The shrapnel in his back didn't just throb now. It burned with the heat of 1,000 needles, stitching a new kind of pain into his soul. The realization didn't hit Enzo like a blow. It seeped into him like the very infection he had carried for a decade. Every brick he had ordered laid for Caruso Heights was a stone placed on Maya's grave. Every threat he had leveled against the golden grain was a strike against the heart that had beaten next to his when his own was failing. Enzo sat in the back of his black sedan, the leather cool against his skin, but his spine was a pillar of fire. He stared at the grainy ID photo in the medical file until the ink seemed to vibrate. The soft curls, the defiant set of the jaw. It was her. The girl from the rain-slicked crates was the woman he had just tried to bury under a mountain of debt and broken glass. "Sir? We're 5 minutes from the board meeting," his driver, Rico, said, catching Enzo's haunted gaze in the rearview mirror. "They're expecting the final signature on the demolition permits." Enzo didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hand, gripped tight around the silver wolf's head of his cane. This hand had signed the orders to cut her power. This hand had authorized the pressure that had left her kneeling in the flower, the very hand she had held in the dark to keep him from slipping away. "Turn the car around," Enzo said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that made the air in the car turn brittle. "Sir? The investors." "I said turn the car around," Enzo snapped, the authority in his voice cutting through the interior like a blade. "Now." The heavy sedan pulled a sharp, screeching U-turn, heading back toward the old district, away from the fortress of glass and toward the smell of scorched flour. As they wove through the narrow streets, Enzo felt a suffocating wave of vertigo. He had spent his life thinking he was the master of his own fate, a god of the skyline. But the truth was written in the jagged scar on his back. He was a king only because a baker had refused to let a nobody die in the dirt. The car slowed as it entered the cobblestoned streets of the district. The street lamps were still dark. His orders. The neighborhood looked wounded, huddled in the shadows of the rising steel towers he had designed to replace it. When they pulled up in front of the bakery, Enzo didn't wait for the door to be opened for him. He stepped out into the damp morning air, his cane striking the pavement with a heavy, rhythmic thud. The front window of the golden grain was boarded up with plywood, a jagged red X spray-painted across the wood. His mark. The mark of the beast. Enzo stood there for a long moment, the silence of the street pressing against his ears. He looked at the scarred wood of the door, the hand-painted sign swinging mournfully in the wind. He remembered the feeling of her flour-dusted hand on his cheek 10 years ago, telling him to make his life worth the thread. He wasn't the Iron Dawn in this moment. He wasn't the builder of skylines. He was the boy in the alley, finally seeing the face of the one who had saved him, and realizing with a soul-crushing certainty that he had become the very darkness she had tried to pull him out of. He reached for the handle of the door, his heart hammering against his ribs, a heart she had stitched back into place. The black sedan sat idling a block away from the golden grain, its tinted windows acting as a one-way mirror into a world Enzo had systematically dismantled. He told Rico to kill the engine. In the sudden silence, the city felt smaller, stripped of its corporate roar, leaving only the sound of his own shallow breathing and the rhythmic throb in his spine. Through the rain-streaked glass, Enzo watched her. Maya was alone. The street was a ghost of its former self, silenced by the pressure Enzo had exerted. But she was moving. She was always moving. She had dragged a heavy wooden ladder out to the sidewalk, her small frame straining against the weight. In the gray, pre-dawn light, her simple green dress was dampened by the mist, clinging to her shoulders as she climbed. A hammer gripped in one hand and a box of nails tucked under her arm. Enzo's grip on his cane tightened until his knuckles went white. He watched as she tried to pry away the jagged plywood his men had nailed over her soul. She was small, but she threw her entire weight into the crowbar, her face contorting with a raw, physical desperation. When the wood finally gave way with a splintering shriek, she stumbled back, nearly losing her footing on the ladder. She didn't stop to catch her breath. She climbed down, gathered the broken shards of her display case, and began to sweep. It was the repetition that gutted him. She swept the glass into a neat pile, then paused to wipe the sweat and flour from her brow with the back of a hand that Enzo now knew had once been stained with his own blood. He watched her pick up a single crushed loaf of bread, one his own boot had flattened, and hold it for a second. She didn't throw it away with rage. She placed it in a bin with a gentleness that felt like a localized earthquake in Enzo's chest. "She's been at it since 4, sir," Rico whispered, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "She hasn't stopped once, not even when the rain started." Enzo said nothing. He couldn't. He was witnessing the true definition of strength, and it had nothing to do with the steel towers or the billion-dollar contracts sitting on his desk 40 floors up. Her strength was a quiet, stubborn flame that refused to go out, even when he had sucked the very oxygen from the room. He saw her pause by the door, her hand resting on the mahogany frame he had scarred with his cane. She looked exhausted, her curls matted to her forehead. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of a legacy he had tried to turn into rubble. For a moment, she looked up at the darkened street lamps, then toward the towering silhouette of Caruso Holdings on the horizon. There was no fear in her gaze, only a weary, bone-deep disappointment. Enzo pulled the medical file onto his lap, the photo of the 19-year-old Angel staring up at him. "Make it worth the thread," she had said. He looked back at the woman in the street, struggling to hammer a fresh piece of molding into place with trembling hands. He had taken her thread and used it to hang her. He had taken her gift of life and used it to build a cage for the very neighborhood that had raised her. As a cold gust of wind knocked the ladder over, Maya stood in the rain, looking at the fallen wood. She didn't cry. She simply reached down and began to lift it again. "Drive," Enzo commanded, his voice barely a ghost of itself. He couldn't sit there any longer. He couldn't watch the person who had given him everything struggle to fix the crumbs he had left behind. He needed to be more than a witness. He needed to be the man she had believed he could be 10 years ago, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built since. The bell above the door gave a strangled, rusty chirp as Enzo pushed his way inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and the ghost of burnt flour. Maya was on a stepladder, trying to nail a piece of trim back into place. She didn't look down, her hammer rhythmically striking the wood with a hollow, tired thud. "We're closed," she said, her voice raspy from the morning chill. "The city cut the power, and the monsters broke the glass. Come back in another life. Maya. The hammer stopped mid-swing. She froze, her shoulders tensing under the thin fabric of her green dress. Slowly she turned, her gaze dropping from the ceiling to the man standing in her doorway. Enzo looked out of place in the ruin, his three-piece suit too dark, his silver-topped cane too polished, his presence too heavy for a room held together by prayers and plywood. He didn't wait for her to speak. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather checkbook. With a steady hand, he laid it on the scarred mahogany counter, the same counter he had struck with his cane 48 hours ago. "Name the amount," Enzo said, his voice low, stripped of its usual predatory edge. "Double the market value, triple. Whatever it takes to get you a new shop in the Uptown district. High-end ovens, marble counters, a staff of 10. You can leave this place behind. You can start over where it's safe." Maya climbed down the ladder, her movements stiff. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and walked toward him, but she didn't look at the checkbook. She looked at his face, her dark eyes searching his features with a sudden, piercing intensity that made Enzo want to flinch. "You think this is about a building?" she asked quietly. "You think I'm standing in the dark because I want better ovens?" "I'm trying to make it right," Enzo insisted, leaning heavily on his cane. The pain in his spine was a white-hot needle, a frantic pulsing of the lid she had once tried to keep from killing him. "I know who you are, Maya. I saw the file. I remember the alley. I remember the rosemary." The silence that followed was deafening. Maya's expression didn't soften. Instead, a look of profound, soul-deep recognition washed over her, followed immediately by a wave of cold horror. She took a half-step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "It was you," she whispered. "The boy in the rain. The one who promised he wouldn't let the darkness take him." "It was me," Enzo said, taking a step toward her. "And I owe you my life. Let me pay the debt. Take the money. Let me build you something better than this." Maya looked at the checkbook, then back at the man who had spent a decade turning into a titan of glass and ice. She didn't see a king. She saw a wasteland. "I didn't save a mafia boss, Enzo," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a righteous, blistering anger. "I saved a human being. I stayed in the mud with you because I believed that every life had a spark of goodness worth protecting. I stitched you up so you could go out and make the world a little less cruel." She leaned over the counter, her face inches from his. The smell of yeast and rosemary on her skin was an indictment. "But look at what you did with the time I gave you," she spat. "You used the hands I saved to crush the very people who fed you. You used the life I gave back to you to build a fortress of greed." She picked up the checkbook and shoved it back toward his chest. "You want to pay your debt? You can't. There isn't enough ink in the world to wash the blood off those bills." I looked at that boy in the trench, and I saw hope. I look at you now, and I see a hollow man. She turned away, picking up her hammer again, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper that cut deeper than any blade. "I saved you, Enzo Caruso, and looking at the monster you've become, it's the only thing in my life I truly regret." Enzo stood frozen, the silver wolf's head of his cane feeling like lead in his hand. The iron dawn had finally been broken, not by a rival's bullet, but by the quiet, devastating regret of the only person who had ever truly loved him without a price. The sky over the district was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and swollen with the coming storm. Enzo sat in his car 3 blocks away, Maya's words, "I regret it," ringing in his ears like a death knell. He had been called a butcher, a tyrant, and a king, but no title had ever stripped him of his skin quite like that one. "Sir," Rico whispered, his voice snapping with sudden tension. "Movement on the corner. That's not our crew." Enzo looked up. Two nondescript gray vans had pulled onto the curb in front of the Golden Grain. Men in dark hoodies spilled out, not with hammers or eviction notices, but with red plastic canisters. His rivals, the Moretti family, had seen the Iron Dawn hesitate. They had seen him stall the demolition for a girl, and they smelled the metallic scent of a weakened predator. They weren't there to buy the lot. They were there to burn the weakness out of Enzo's territory. "Go," Enzo growled. The sedan roared to life, but before they could reach the shop, the first Molotov cocktail shattered against the bakery's boarded-up window. An orange blossom of fire erupted, licking greedily at the dry plywood and the hand-painted sign. Enzo didn't wait for the car to stop. He threw the door open, his cane striking the pavement with a violent, uneven cadence as he lunged toward the flames. The shrapnel in his back screamed, a white-hot agony that felt like the lead was trying to melt into his very marrow, but he ignored it. He had spent 10 years running from the boy in the dirt. Tonight, he would fight for him. "Enzo, get back!" Rico shouted, drawing his weapon as the Moretti soldiers turned, surprised by the sudden arrival of the boss himself. Enzo didn't reach for a gun. He raised his silver-topped cane like a mace. The first man who rushed him with a gasoline can met the heavy wolf's head of the cane squarely in the jaw. The man crumpled, but 3 more took his place. "Maya!" Enzo roared, his voice tearing through the sound of shattering glass. "Maya, get out!" The front door of the bakery burst open. Maya stumbled out, coughing, her green dress singed at the hem, her eyes wide with terror as she saw the orange glow reflecting in the rain-slicked street. She saw Enzo, the man who had destroyed her shop, now standing between her and a line of men holding fire. "Get behind me," Enzo commanded. He stood silhouetted against the growing inferno, his expensive suit jacket smoking from the heat. He leaned heavily on his cane, his legs trembling, but his eyes were fixed on the men in the shadows. "You want this lot?" Enzo's voice was a jagged snarl that silenced the crackle of the flames. "You have to go through the man she saved." A Moretti soldier leveled a pistol. A shot rang out, clipping the brickwork inches from Enzo's head. He didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his shadow lengthening in the firelight, an ancient, territorial beast defending its only sanctuary. Rico and the rest of the Caruso security detail swarmed the street, the air filling with the sharp, rhythmic pops of gunfire and the scent of ozone. Enzo felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a stray bullet grazed him, but he didn't fall. He turned, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from the back of his car and rushing toward the storefront. He threw himself at the flames, beating back the fire that threatened to consume the mahogany counter, the flour-stained floor, and the history he had almost helped erase. The Moretti vans sped away as the neighborhood began to wake, windows opening, voices shouting in the dark. The strike had failed, but the bakery was a scorched shell. Enzo collapsed against the blackened doorframe, his lungs burning, his expensive suit ruined and caked in ash. He dropped his cane, his hands shaking as he looked at the woman standing in the middle of the street. Maya approached him slowly. She didn't thank him. She looked at his bleeding shoulder, then at the charred remains of her family's sign lying in the gutter. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you risk your life for a building you wanted to tear down?" Enzo looked up at her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes finally clear of the glass and steel coldness that had defined him for a decade. "Because you were right," he wheezed, clutching his side. "The boy in the trench, he was worth the thread. I just had to remember who he was." 6 months later, the morning sun didn't strike a fortress of glass. It reflected off a redesigned masterpiece of architecture that the critics were calling the heart of the district. Enzo Caruso stood on the newly paved cobblestones of the central plaza, his dark three-piece suit back in place, though he moved with a slower, more deliberate grace. The heavy, silver-topped cane was still in his hand, but he no longer used it as a scepter of fear. Surrounding him were the soaring towers of Caruso Heights, sleek and modern, yet they didn't crush the earth beneath them. Instead, the entire billion-dollar complex curved in a protective, graceful arc around a single, two-story brick building. The Golden Grain had been rebuilt, not with sterile marble, but with reclaimed wood and the same stubborn spirit that had built it 3 generations ago. The hand-painted sign had been restored, swinging gently in the autumn breeze. The smell of rosemary and warm yeast drifted upward, mingling with the expensive espresso of the high-end boutiques that now considered the bakery their most prestigious neighbor. "The board still thinks you've lost your mind," Marco said, stepping up beside Enzo. He looked at the redesigned courtyard, where foot traffic was steered naturally toward the bakery's open door. "We lost 10 units of retail space just to keep her sightlines clear. The investors are calling it a sentimental luxury." Enzo looked at the mahogany door of the shop, where a fresh delivery of flour was being carried inside. "They call it a luxury because they don't understand the foundation," Enzo replied, his voice a low, steady hum. "This building is the only thing in this plaza that isn't for sale. That's what gives the rest of it value." As he spoke, Maya stepped out onto the sidewalk to water the window boxes. She wore a new apron, though it was already dusted with the familiar white clouds of her trade. She looked up, her gaze catching Enzo's across the bustling plaza. There was no longer anger in her eyes, nor the cold disappointment that had shattered him months ago. There was a quiet, professional respect, the look of 2 survivors who had finally found a way to inhabit the same world. She gave him a single brief nod before disappearing back inside to tend to the morning rush. Enzo felt the familiar thrum of the shrapnel in his back. The surgery had been successful, but the scar remained, a permanent map of his debt. He walked toward the bakery, the thud click of his cane sounding like a heartbeat against the stone. He didn't go inside. He simply stopped by the window, watching the neighborhood people, the same ones he had tried to evict, lining up for their daily bread. He saw his own security detail, the most dangerous men in the city, standing at the corners of the plaza. They weren't there to collect taxes or enforce silence. They were there to ensure that not a single stone of the Golden Grain would ever be touched again. Enzo Caruso had spent 40 years building a kingdom of ice, and only to realize that a king is nothing without a soul to defend. He looked up at the towers he had built, then back at the small wooden door propped open to the street. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a territory to be conquered. He was looking at a home he had finally made himself worthy of. The thread had held. The boy in the dirt had finally grown up, and the bakery at the center of the glass fortress was the only thing that made the skyline worth the view.